Story 1. The Wrong House. Chapter 1, The Perfect Escape. The countryside was supposed to be a fresh start for Mark and Emily, a place to get away from the suffocating city and reconnect with each other. After a year of stressful jobs, arguments, and a miscarriage that had devastated them both, they needed to heal. The house they found was perfect, a spacious, old Victorian nestled at the edge of a small village. It had charm, history, and, most importantly, privacy. "This will be good for us," Mark said as they pulled up to the house, the sky overcast with clouds that threatened rain. He took Emily's hand. A real fresh start. Emily, her face pale and tired, nodded but said nothing. The house loomed before them, dark and imposing despite its quaint appearance. Its windows stared down at them like hollow eyes, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Yet something about it called to them, a strange pull they both felt. They had been looking for months, but no place had felt quite right, until this one. It had been listed for sale for a long time, yet no one had bought it. The realtor had seemed eager to offload it when they expressed interest, offering it at an absurdly low price. "It's too good to be true," Emily had said at the time, laughing. But Mark shrugged it off. Now, standing in front of the house, a chill crept up her spine. She pushed the feeling aside. It was just nerves, she told herself. A new place, a new chapter. Everything would be fine. As they unpacked, the first drops of rain began to fall, softly tapping on the roof. It was the kind of steady, persistent rain that seemed to soak into the very earth, the kind that could last for days. By the time night fell, the rain had become a relentless downpour. The sound was constant, drumming against the windows and roof, filling the house with an eerie rhythm. "Perfect weather for settling in, right?" Mark said, trying to keep things light. Emily offered him a weak smile, but something about the rain made her uneasy. It felt oppressive, like it was trying to drown out the world beyond their walls. She shook the thought from her mind and went to bed, hoping for a good night's sleep in their new home. But sleep did not come easily. Chapter 2, Strange Noises. In the middle of the night, Emily awoke to a strange sound, something scraping against the floorboards below their bedroom. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The rain was still pouring, but there was something else. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" Mark groaned, half asleep. "It's just the house settling, babe. Old houses make noise." But this didn't sound like settling. It sounded like something, or someone, moving downstairs. A dragging, scraping noise that sent chills down her spine. "I'm going to check it out," she whispered, slipping out of bed. "Emily, come on," Mark mumbled, but she was already grabbing a flashlight and heading down the creaky stairs. The house was cold and dark, the rain hammering against the windows. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound stopped. She shone her flashlight around the living room, the beam cutting through the shadows. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease remained. Then she saw it. On the floor, in front of the fireplace, were faint, wet footprints. They were muddy, as if someone had walked through the rain and come inside. But they led nowhere, they just stopped in the middle of the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She backed away, her heart racing, and hurried back upstairs. Mark was already asleep again when she returned to the bedroom. She stood there for a moment, staring at him, wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. But the footprints, she hadn't imagined those. She climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The sound of the rain, constant and heavy, filled the room. It was a long time before she fell asleep. Chapter 3, The Voices in the Rain. The next day, the rain hadn't let up. It pounded relentlessly against the windows, a thick, gray curtain that blurred the world outside. Mark spent the day fixing things around the house while Emily tried to shake off the unease from the night before. But as the day wore on, the feeling only intensified. The house felt wrong. It was something she couldn't explain, but she could feel it in her bones. The air was heavy, thick with a tension she couldn't identify. That afternoon, as she was unpacking boxes in the living room, she heard something that made her freeze. Beneath the sound of the rain was something else, faint, but unmistakable. Whispers. She turned, listening hard. The whispers were soft, almost lost beneath the constant drumming of the rain, but they were there. She couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be coming from the walls. Her breath quickened as she pressed her ear against the plaster. The voices were louder now, murmuring in low tones, like a conversation just out of reach. Mark walked in, startling her. "Emily? You okay?" She jumped back from the wall, her heart pounding. Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" Mark asked, looking around. "The voices," she whispered, her voice shaking. "In the walls." Mark frowned, stepping closer to her. "Emily, it's just the rain. You're probably hearing the water running through the pipes or something." But Emily wasn't convinced. The whispers had felt too real, too deliberate. She had heard them, she knew she had. Mark wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You're just stressed. We've been through a lot. Maybe we should take a break from unpacking, go into town tomorrow." Emily nodded, but the whispers still echoed in her mind. Chapter 4: The Locked Room. That night, the rain showed no signs of stopping. It came down in sheets, a ceaseless torrent that rattled the windows and made the air feel damp and cold. Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The house creaked and groaned around her, the noises amplifying the storm outside. Mark was sound asleep beside her, oblivious to her growing anxiety. At around 2 a.m., the sound came again. This time, it wasn't just scraping. It was the distinct sound of something moving, furniture being dragged, floorboards creaking beneath weight. Emily's heart raced. She slipped out of bed again, this time grabbing a heavy flashlight and heading down the hall. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the house, where they hadn't yet explored. As she approached, she noticed something strange. A door she hadn't seen before, tucked away at the very end of the corridor, almost hidden in the shadows. It was locked. Emily's hand trembled as she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The scraping sound came again, this time from directly behind the door. She stepped back, her pulse quickening, before turning and rushing back to the bedroom. She didn't wake Mark this time. Instead, she climbed back into bed, her heart racing, and listened as the sound of the dragging furniture slowly faded into the relentless pounding of the rain. Chapter 5: Uncovering the Past. The next day, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. While Mark was outside, fixing the gutter that had started leaking, she went into town and found the local library. There, she began researching the history of their new home. What she found chilled her to the core. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, the Langfords, who had lived there for several generations. But the last Langford, a man named Thomas Langford, had been involved in a scandal that ended in bloodshed. Thomas had been accused of murdering his wife and 2 young children in the house. The details were murky, but according to local legend, Thomas had gone mad, claiming that the house was speaking to him. He insisted that it was the rain, it had told him to do it. After the murders, Thomas had locked himself in one of the rooms, refusing to come out. When the authorities finally broke down the door, they found him dead, a gunshot wound to his head. The room had been sealed ever since. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized the room she had heard the noises coming from, the one with the locked door, was the very room where Thomas Langford had died. She hurried home, her mind racing. She had to tell Mark. They had to get out of the house. Chapter 6: The Room Revealed. When she got back, Mark was waiting for her in the kitchen, looking concerned. "Where were you?" "I've been looking all over." Emily told him everything, about the house's history, the murders, the voices she had heard. But as she spoke, she could see the doubt in his eyes. "Emily, come on," he said gently. "You're letting the stories get to you. This is just an old house." It's creaky and strange, sure, but there's no such thing as ghosts. You didn't hear them, she insisted, her voice trembling. There's something in that room. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. Let's go look. If it'll make you feel better. Together, they walked down the long, dark hallway to the locked room. The rain was still coming down hard, making the house feel damp and claustrophobic. Mark tried the door, but it was still locked. See? There's nothing here, he said. But then, with a loud click, the door swung open on its own. They stared at the door in stunned silence. Inside, the room was dark and cold. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something rotting. Mark stepped inside, but Emily hesitated at the threshold. Then they heard it. The whispering. It was louder now, more distinct, echoing through the room like a chorus of voices. They were coming from the walls, from the very structure of the house itself. Mark's face paled. What the hell is that? I told you, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. We need to leave. Now. But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them. Chapter 7, The Rain's Secret. Trapped in the room, the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. Mark and Emily pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pulsing with the sounds of the rain. And then they saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes. Thomas Langford. The whispers grew louder as the figure stepped forward, its eyes locked on Emily. You shouldn't have come here, the figure rasped. The rain, it never stops. Emily's heart raced as the figure approached, but Mark grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door. With one final shove, the door flew open, and they stumbled out into the hallway. They didn't stop running until they were outside, the rain pouring down in sheets around them. They never went back inside that house. Not even to collect their things. The whispers followed them, echoing in the rain as they drove away, leaving the house behind. But the rain never stopped. Not even when they were far away. Story 2. A New Beginning. Sophie and James had been looking for the perfect house for months. Their dream was to escape the hectic city life and settle down in the peaceful countryside. After what seemed like an endless search, they finally found it. Nestled in a remote village, the house was an old, charming Victorian with overgrown ivy climbing its brick walls and large oak trees shading the front yard. The price was too good to be true, but they didn't question it. They saw it as a blessing, not a warning. This is it, James. It feels perfect, Sophie said, running her hand along the iron gate that opened into the vast garden. James smiled and nodded, happy to see Sophie excited after all the stressful months of planning and house hunting. The house had a strange air about it, something old and forgotten, like it had stood silently for too long. Still, it was everything they had wanted: isolation, history, and character. They signed the papers quickly, eager to start their new life. But from the first day, the rain started. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. The steady drizzle that began on the day they moved in soon became a daily occurrence. Sophie, normally unaffected by weather, began to feel uneasy. The rain wasn't just rain, it was heavy, unyielding, as if it was drenching the house, soaking the very foundation with its weight. It made everything darker and more oppressive than it should have been. James brushed it off. It's just weather. We're not in the city anymore. Countryside rains more, that's all. Sophie tried to accept that, but something gnawed at her. There was something in the rain, something watching. Chapter 2, The First Night. On their first night in the house, Sophie lay awake, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. It felt unnatural, too loud, too constant. She turned over in bed, trying to ignore the unease that crept over her. Then came the sound. A soft but distinct knocking, 3 sharp raps from somewhere in the house. Sophie's heart skipped. She listened again, holding her breath, waiting for it to happen once more. But it didn't. "James," she whispered, but he was sound asleep next to her, completely unaware. She stayed awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for the knocking to return. It never did. But the next day, she found something odd, a door in the hallway she hadn't noticed before. It was locked, and no matter how hard she twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. "What's in there?" she asked James later. "I don't know. It's probably just a closet." "These old houses have so many weird quirks," he said with a laugh, not paying it much mind. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind that door, something watching her, even through the thick wood. Chapter 3: The History. Days passed, and the rain persisted. Every night, Sophie heard the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate raps. It happened at the same time, always after midnight, always from somewhere deeper in the house. One day, while unpacking, Sophie found an old box tucked away in the attic, hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. Inside were newspapers, clippings that told a horrifying story. The house, it turned out, wasn't as abandoned as they thought. It had a dark history, one that no one had mentioned when they bought it. The previous owners, a couple much like Sophie and James, had moved in decades earlier. They, too, had been charmed by the house and its secluded beauty. But shortly after moving in, the wife began to hear noises, knocking, whispering, strange sounds from behind the walls. The husband dismissed her concerns, convinced it was all in her head. Until one night, she disappeared. The police searched the house for days, but she was never found. The husband, distraught and inconsolable, claimed that the house had taken her, that something inside the walls had come for her. He was found dead a week later, his body hanging in the same hallway where Sophie had heard the knocking. Sophie's hands trembled as she read the clippings. Her stomach churned as she realized the knocking she heard every night was no coincidence. It was the same knocking the wife had heard before she vanished. She rushed downstairs, clutching the papers, but James wasn't there. She called out for him, her voice trembling with panic, but there was no answer. Chapter 4: Missing. The rain fell harder that night, slamming against the windows as Sophie paced the house, calling for James. He had gone out to the hardware store earlier in the day but had yet to return. Hours passed, and her calls went unanswered. His phone went straight to voicemail, and the roads were washed out from the endless rain. She sat by the window, staring into the dark garden, trying to convince herself he was fine, that he would come home any minute now. But as the rain pelted the windows, the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her. Then, just as she was about to give up and go to bed, the knocking returned. 3 sharp raps. This time, they were louder, as if coming from directly behind her. Sophie's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide. Nothing. The house was empty, but the knocking continued. It echoed through the hallways, louder now, insistent. It was no longer just in one spot, it came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then the whispers began. Soft, barely audible at first, like voices carried by the wind. They seemed to be coming from the locked door she had found in the hallway, the door that still wouldn't open. Sophie's fear turned to terror as she realized she was trapped. The house seemed to be alive, its walls groaning under the weight of something unseen, something ancient. She rushed to the door, banging on it, screaming for James, but there was no answer. Only the knocking, relentless, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. Chapter 5: The Wrong House. Sophie couldn't stay in the house any longer. She had to leave, to get out of the rain, to escape whatever was inside those walls. She grabbed her keys, threw on her coat, and rushed to the front door. But when she opened it, the world outside was nothing but rain, a solid wall of water that stretched as far as she could see. The garden, the road, the village, it was all gone, swallowed by the storm. Sophie stepped back, her heart racing. The rain had cut her off, trapping her inside the house with no way out. Desperate, she ran back into the hallway, back to the locked door. She had to see what was behind it, had to know what was causing the knocking, the whispers, the terror that gripped her. She grabbed a hammer from the kitchen and began pounding on the door, splintering the wood with each blow. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was behind the door knew she was coming. Finally, the door gave way, crashing open with a deafening crack. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a woman, her back to Sophie, her long, dark hair hanging limp and wet over her shoulders. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, her head slightly bowed as if she were listening to the rain. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't move. But Sophie knew, deep down, she knew, this wasn't James. This wasn't anyone she had ever met. And then the woman turned. Her face was a twisted mask of rage and sorrow, her eyes hollow and black. Her mouth opened, and the sound that came out wasn't a scream or a shout, it was the knocking. 3 sharp raps. Sophie stumbled back, her legs trembling, as the woman rose from the chair. The knocking grew louder, reverberating through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. Sophie turned and ran, but the rain outside was no longer rain, it was a barrier, thick and impenetrable. She was trapped, caught between the house and the storm, with nowhere to go. Chapter 6, The End. By the time the authorities arrived, the house was empty. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside eerily quiet. Inside, they found no sign of Sophie or James. The house was cold, damp, and silent. But in the hallway, they found something strange, a locked door, splintered and broken. And beyond it, an empty room with a single chair. The villagers whispered about the house, about the strange couple who had moved in only to vanish like those before them. Some said the house was cursed, that it had a way of taking people, trapping them in its walls. Others claimed it was the rain, endless, relentless rain that brought the house to life. No one ever lived in the house again. It stood abandoned, forgotten, waiting for the next unlucky souls who might wander in, unaware that they had chosen the wrong house. The rain, however, never stopped. Story 3. Chapter 1, The Move. Nathan and Grace had been married for 5 years, and they were ready for a change. City life had taken its toll, work stress, sleepless nights, and a general feeling of being disconnected from each other. So, when they stumbled upon an old, countryside manor for sale online, they jumped at the opportunity. It seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, and affordable. Too affordable, but they chose not to question it. "It's everything we've been looking for," Grace had said when they first visited the house. The sprawling garden, ivy-covered walls, and ancient oak trees gave the place a mystical charm. The house, however, had a coldness to it. There was something off about it from the start, though neither Nathan nor Grace voiced their unease. The rooms were spacious but dim, with odd drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. And then there was the rain, constant, heavy, and unrelenting. By the time they officially moved in, the skies had turned gray, and a steady drizzle began. It rained every day after that. It felt as if the house itself had summoned the storm. Still, they were determined to make it work. Nathan worked remotely, setting up his office in a study at the back of the house, while Grace busied herself with fixing up the garden. They thought the house would bring them closer, a place to reconnect. But from the very first night, strange things began to happen. Chapter 2, A Visitor in the Night. Their first night in the house was restless. The rain drummed against the windows, filling the house with an eerie, hollow sound. The wind howled outside, bending the old trees that surrounded the property. Grace had always loved the sound of rain, but this was different. It wasn't soothing. It felt oppressive, like the rain was trying to drown the house itself. Around midnight, Grace woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was Nathan walking down the hall to get water, but when she reached out, he was still next to her, fast asleep. She held her breath and listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and came from the hallway just outside their bedroom door. It was the sound of heavy boots on creaky floorboards. Her heart raced. "Nathan," she whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled groggily. "There's someone in the house," she hissed. Nathan sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. He grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and got out of bed. Grace watched as he moved toward the door, her pulse quickening with every step. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. "See? Nothing," he said, turning back to her. But Grace knew she hadn't imagined it. Someone, or something, had been walking just outside their door. Chapter 3: The Locked Room. The next morning, Grace was determined to explore the house more thoroughly. There were still parts of it they hadn't yet explored, rooms that were dusty and locked. It was an old house, full of strange nooks and crannies. In the back of the house, down a narrow hallway, Grace found a door that was locked. The handle was cold and rusted, but despite her efforts, she couldn't budge it. When she asked Nathan about it later, he shrugged. "It's probably just an old storage room. We can figure out how to open it later," he said. But something about the door bothered her. It felt wrong. As if something was behind it. Watching. As the days passed, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house. There were moments when she would catch movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows slipping through doorways or figures standing at the end of the hall, only to disappear when she looked directly at them. And then there were the sounds. Footsteps in the night. Faint whispering, just below the sound of the rain. It was never loud enough to understand, but she could feel it, a presence lurking, just out of reach. Grace tried to ignore it, but the house felt colder, darker with each passing day. Even Nathan started to notice. "This house gives me the creeps sometimes," he admitted one night as they sat in the living room, the rain pounding against the windows. Grace nodded, but didn't say anything. She didn't want to tell him how bad it had really gotten for her, the feeling that someone, or something, was always there, just behind her. Chapter 4: The Shadow. One evening, Nathan was working late in his office while Grace sat in the living room reading. The rain had picked up again, turning into a torrential downpour. The wind howled through the trees, making the old house groan and creak. Grace was trying to focus on her book when she heard it again, footsteps. They were louder this time, heavier, and they were coming from the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, clutching the book in her hand like a weapon. The sound moved closer, the slow, deliberate thuds of boots on the wooden floor. She took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The light was dim, flickering slightly as if something was tampering with the electricity. The hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent, but she could feel it, something was there, watching her. And then she saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, stood at the far end of the hall. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But Grace knew it was watching her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow began to move, slowly at first, then faster, charging down the hall toward her. Grace stumbled backward, gasping, as the shadow reached her. But as it approached, it disappeared, vanishing into the walls like smoke. Shaking, Grace ran to Nathan's office. Chapter 5: The Discovery. Grace found Nathan hunched over his computer, oblivious to what had just happened. She tried to explain, but her words came out in a rush. "There's something in the house," she said, her voice trembling. Nathan looked at her, concern in his eyes. "What do you mean? What did you see?" "I don't know," Grace stammered. "A shadow, something dark. It's been following me. I feel it all the time, but tonight, it was different. It was real." Nathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Grace, we're both exhausted. This house is old, and it's been raining non-stop for weeks. Maybe you just need a break." But Grace wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, wasn't just in her head. It was real. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace wandered the house in search of answers. She found herself standing in front of the locked door again, the one in the back hallway. something drew her to it. She pushed against the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open. The lock had broken, leaving the door slightly ajar. The room beyond was small and dusty, filled with old, decaying furniture. But in the corner, she found something that made her blood run cold, a tattered, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, and the words inside chilled her to the core. It belonged to a woman who had lived in the house years ago. She, too, had experienced the footsteps, the whispers, the shadows. The journal described how the presence in the house had grown stronger, more dangerous, until it consumed her. The final entry read, "It's in the rain. It comes with the rain. And once it comes, it never leaves." Chapter 6, The Rain's Curse. The rain never stopped. Day after day, the downpour soaked the earth, turning the garden into a swamp and casting the house into a permanent gloom. Grace couldn't sleep. Every night, she heard the footsteps, the whispers, the knocking at their bedroom door. The shadow appeared more frequently, growing bolder, no longer content to stay hidden at the edges of her vision. One night, Grace woke to find Nathan standing at the foot of their bed, staring out the window. His eyes were wide and blank, as if he were in a trance. "Nathan," she whispered, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, he turned and walked out of the room, heading down the hall toward the back of the house. Grace followed, her heart racing, trying to wake him, but he didn't stop. He walked straight to the locked room, the one where she had found the journal, and stood in front of it. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the door. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and knocked 3 times, soft, deliberate knocks that echoed through the house. The door creaked open, and Nathan stepped inside. Grace rushed after him, but when she entered the room, he was gone. The room was empty, save for the journal lying on the floor. The whispers filled the air around her, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the rain itself, seeping through the walls, the windows, the very structure of the house. Grace screamed for Nathan, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Chapter 7, The Truth Revealed. Desperate, Grace fled the house and sought out answers in the nearby village. She found an elderly woman, Margaret, who had lived there her whole life and knew the history of the manor. "You should never have moved into that house," Margaret told her. Story 4. Alex and Maya had been married for 3 years when they decided to leave the city behind and settle into a quieter life in the countryside. They were both burnt out from their high-pressure jobs and longed for a simpler existence. So when they found a large, old house on the outskirts of a remote village at a bargain price, it seemed like fate had finally smiled upon them. The house was massive, with creaking wooden floors, antique furniture, and a sprawling, overgrown garden. Its isolated location, surrounded by thick woods and far from any neighbors, added to its charm. For Alex, it was exactly what they needed, peace and solitude. But from the moment they arrived, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "It's beautiful," Maya said as she stood in front of the house, but her voice lacked the enthusiasm Alex had hoped for. "I know it's a little old, but we can make it ours. Think of the history here, all the people who lived in this place before us," Alex said, trying to reassure her. Maya nodded but couldn't shake the unsettling sense that something was watching them, lurking in the shadowed windows of the upper floors. It was just her nerves, she told herself. The stress of the move and the change in lifestyle were getting to her. Or so she thought. Chapter 2, The First Night. On their first night in the house, the rain began. It came down hard, pounding on the windows and roof, creating a drumming sound that filled the dark hallways. Alex and Maya sat in their newly furnished living room, drinking wine and trying to relax after a long day of unpacking. The rain outside felt relentless, as though it had a life of its own, echoing through the house and amplifying the old, groaning beams. Around midnight, Maya decided to head to bed while Alex stayed up a little longer to work on his laptop. As she climbed the stairs, the house seemed to breathe, settling into its old bones. Maya turned down the hallway to their bedroom, her footsteps echoing eerily on the creaky floorboards. Just as she was about to reach their door, she heard a strange noise, a faint, distant whisper. followed by the sound of a door creaking open somewhere down the hall. Her heart raced. She stood still, listening, but heard nothing more. The house was old, it made strange sounds, she reasoned. Shaking her head, she dismissed the incident as nothing more than her imagination. But as she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Chapter 3: The Stranger. The next morning, Maya woke up to find Alex already downstairs, drinking coffee and looking at the rain-soaked view from the kitchen window. The downpour hadn't let up. "I had the weirdest dream last night," Maya said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Oh?" Alex replied, still focused on the storm outside. "I dreamt that I heard someone whispering. Like, right outside the door," Maya explained. "I thought I heard a door opening too, but I know it sounds ridiculous." Alex laughed softly. "This old house is just settling. We'll get used to it." Maya tried to believe him, but the dream had felt so real, and she hadn't been able to shake off the unease. Later that day, while unpacking boxes in the study, Maya found an old photograph buried under a pile of dusty books. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the house. The photo was yellowed with age, and the family members looked oddly formal, their expressions grim. "Look at this," Maya said, showing Alex the picture. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Probably the previous owners. This place has had a lot of families over the years. Who knows how old that is?" Maya stared at the photograph, unsettled by the cold, vacant expressions on their faces. Something about the picture unnerved her, but she couldn't explain why. Chapter 4: The Locked Room. Over the next week, the rain continued without a break. Maya found herself growing more uneasy each day. The house, once charming and full of potential, now felt suffocating. It wasn't just the rain, it was the feeling that they were never truly alone. One evening, while exploring the second floor, Maya came across a room she hadn't noticed before. The door was locked, and no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't budge. "Alex, do you know what's behind this door?" she asked later that night. "I don't think we've tried opening it yet." "Maybe it's just a closet or storage room," he replied, not giving it much thought. But Maya couldn't let it go. She felt an inexplicable pull toward that door, as though something on the other side was calling to her. That night, the whispering returned. Maya awoke to the sound of soft, indistinct voices coming from the hallway. Her heart pounded as she lay still, listening. It was the same sound she had heard on their first night in the house. This time, though, it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Slowly, she got out of bed and crept to the door. The whispers seemed to be coming from the locked room. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, but it remained firmly shut. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and a cold draft blew through the hallway. Maya shivered and hurried back to bed, too scared to investigate further. Chapter 5: The Haunting. Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew louder. At first, it was only at night, but soon Maya began hearing them during the day as well. They seemed to follow her from room to room, always just out of earshot, but unmistakably there. Alex noticed her growing anxiety and tried to reassure her. "It's just the house, Maya. Old houses make noise. Maybe it's the wind, or the rain getting into the walls." But Maya wasn't convinced. The whispers were too distinct, too human. She began to feel as though the house itself was trying to communicate with her. Then, one night, something happened that shook her to her core. She was in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard a faint knock on the bedroom door. Startled, she sat up and listened. There it was again, 3 soft, deliberate knocks. "Alex," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Someone's knocking." Alex groggily got up and opened the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but as they both stood in the doorway, they heard it again, a knock, this time from further down the hall. It was coming from the locked room. Without a word, Alex grabbed a flashlight and led Maya down the hall. The rain pounded on the roof above them as they approached the locked door. Alex tried the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Then, as if in response to his touch, the door creaked open on its own. Maya gasped. Inside, the room was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. But something felt wrong. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and decay. And then they saw it, something moving in the corner of the room. At first, they thought it was a shadow, but as their eyes adjusted, they realized it was a figure. A man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still, his face obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" Alex called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned toward them, revealing hollow, sunken eyes and a mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. Maya screamed, and Alex slammed the door shut, pulling her back down the hallway. They didn't stop running until they were outside the house, drenched in the pouring rain. Chapter 6: The Truth. The next day, they went to the village to seek answers. They found an old woman named Elsie, who had lived there her entire life and knew the history of the house. "You should never have bought that place," Elsie said gravely when they told her about the strange occurrences. "It's been empty for years, ever since the Langley family disappeared. They were the last to live there. People say the house is cursed, that it's haunted by their spirits." Maya's heart sank. "What happened to them?" "No one knows for sure," Elsie said, her voice low. "They say the family went mad, driven insane by the constant rain. One by one, they vanished. Some believe the house itself took them. Others say something far worse lives there, something that hides in the rain and never leaves." Chapter 7: The Final Night. Despite Elsie's warnings, Alex and Maya returned to the house. They didn't have anywhere else to go, and Alex was determined not to be scared out of their new home. But that night, the rain was heavier than ever. The whispers were louder, almost deafening. The house groaned and creaked as though it was alive, and the figure in the locked room haunted Maya's every thought. Around midnight, the knocking returned. This time, it was coming from all directions, on the walls, the windows, the floors. The house trembled under the weight of the storm. Alex and Maya huddled together in their bedroom, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, the door to their room creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. It was the man from the locked room, his twisted grin wide and his hollow eyes fixed on them. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.